I designed a custom Elden Ring chess set a couple months ago, turning the basic chess pieces into characters from the base game. But one set wouldn't be enough to fill an entire chessboard, so now I've made a second one with the help of some of your suggestions. But this time I've picked characters from the DLC Shadow of the Erdtree. Under the first video, some of you commented that the characters I chose were boring, so I'm curious what you think about these new ones. The character representing the pawn is probably not what you expect, so I will let you figure out who it is while we're creating it. At the base of every chess piece is, well, the base. For now, it'll just be a simple shape like this that the character can be modeled on. But how do we even start creating the character? You could build it from scratch, starting with a few simple shapes, but at this point I've done that so many times that I now just use one of my pre-made models to save some time. He is very flexible and willing to do almost everything, so we can now put him into a few different poses that could work for the character. But now, how does this turn into the final fully rendered character? Let's start by blocking out all his characteristics that are still missing. He doesn't have any clothes, but a big meaty backpack, which is pretty easy to model with a few simple shapes. And so he's lonely. He also has some fun friends with him that cover most of his body. Lastly, a few more smaller details like the shackle, cloth piece and chains, and the blockout is done. Now you can probably already see who it is, which means the last step to finalize him is to refine all these rough blocked out shapes. For this set, I chose to use the jar innards as the pawn. I used Alexander the Jar in the original set, so I thought it would be cool to have his broken, grotesque cousin on the other side to show the contrast of the two worlds. This piece was pretty simple to model though. The next character was a bit more stubborn and introduced a few new problems that needed to be solved for it to even be printable.
I ain't never settled, so you better up the skirt. Put the pedal to the floor, yo, check the dashboard, cause they...
I asked you in a community post what characters would work best for this second set, and you had quite a few different suggestions for all the pieces, except for the rook. The furnace golem was by far the most common answer, and I think it fits pretty well. But there were 3 problems that made this piece harder to create than you might think. This right here is one of those problems. Just like last time, these pieces are designed to be printed with a 3D printer. These individual bars holding all the burning material inside are way too thin to be printed properly. I needed to find a way to keep the structure of them while somehow also adding more stability. And during the blockout, I found a pretty good solution. To create the individual bars, I created this simple cone shape and extracted the vertical edges so I can give them some thickness. But the space between the bars is still way too thin. So why not just fill it with the original cone? Now you can still see the structure of the bars while also giving them more stability. The second problem is caused by the basic design of the character. It's one of the hottest things in the game in more than just one way. And one reason for that is that it's literally burning. How do you 3D model fire? You could just simulate it and then turn that simulation into a mesh, but the easier way to do it, in my opinion, is to just sculpt it. Add a simple sphere, give it a quick swirl, duplicate it a couple of times, and then refine it a bit more in sculpt mode. I'm not the best at sculpting elements, but I think this is pretty lit if you ask me. The last problem appeared right at the end of the refinement process. The bars needed a second solid layer so they don't break as easily, but what am I supposed to do with these? Well, if adding thickness to the bars helped, why not make these fingers also just much thicker? And that worked quite well. They're actually pretty hard to break now. Just, be a little careful while removing the supports if you print these yourself. I'll talk more on how you can do that later in the video. For the knight piece, there were quite a few different suggestions. Flaming sword, big hammer, undead skeleton, other big hammer, bare feet. But the one I went with is this guy. In the previous set, the knight is represented by the tree sentinel, so I thought it would be cool to contrast the knight riding a horse with a knight riding a pig. Or boar, to be exact. I don't want to slander this cutie. The workflows for these two was actually pretty similar. Even the pose I like the most looks a lot like the first piece. This is also the first character in this set wearing actual armor. There will be a lot more armor modeling in the other pieces, so for this one, let's just go with a simple modeling compilation. To spice up the base a bit, I thought I could add these dust trails to show the front legs lifting off the ground. But while doing a test print, I realized that this made removing the print supports between the back legs really hard. So unfortunately, I had to remove them. There's always this fine line between making these pieces super detailed and cool while also having to make sure that what you're creating is actually printable. His lance is a great example for that. It's basically just a long, thin cylinder. You might think having a long, thin cylinder is great until you try to print it. The bottom of his lance grip broke off twice during the test prints because it was so thin. So I had to make the whole thing much bigger than I initially thought just to make it strong enough. Compared to the last set, the bishop has probably made the biggest transformation out of all the pieces. It went from probably the easiest out of all of them to possibly the hardest I've made so far. There were quite a few character suggestions for the bishop, but Moby right here made the best suggestion. The bishop should be Mesmer and Renala. You would need to find a way to show that they are both bishops, and I agree. Unfortunately. To give myself as much room as possible, I wanted to make the base pretty squarish. But a simple square would be kind of boring, so I thought it could start with a smaller round base and then spread out using these big rocks. This also gives the piece more height, making it easier to distinguish and showing the importance of it. And in case you're wondering, yes, this is not Renala with the long banana head, this is Relana, her sister. I think that's who Moby meant in his comment. At least from my research, that makes a lot more sense. For the poses, it was hard to find something that gives both of them enough room, but after a little bit of tweaking, I thought this would work quite well. So now with both of them in pose, let's model their outfits. Armor can be blocked out in two main ways. Mesmer's chainmail neck piece, for example, can be created by duplicating his neck geometry and then pushing it a bit further outwards. Relana's chest piece, on the other hand, has to be modeled from scratch on top of the actual body. For more defined pieces, this is a lot easier than trying to reuse her torso geometry, but unfortunately it also takes a lot longer. After some time, you end up with this. Looks pretty cool, but it can get better. These big plates can be separated into multiple smaller pieces to add more depth and variety. But it can get better. The edges of all the plates can be duplicated and turned into these tubes to refine the borders of all the plates. This actually makes quite a big difference. But it can get even better. This ornamental texture can be used to displace the surface of the plates, basically transferring the pattern onto the plates and giving it a lot more detail. I've discovered this technique during the creation of my last chess set, so if you want to learn a little bit more about that, make sure to check out that video after this one. Now it looks a lot better than before, but it can get even... never mind. This is as detailed as it gets. Just like the furnace golem fire, I also used sculpting to create Relana's magic effects on her swords, as well as Mesmer's flame. And that's basically how the bishop piece has been created. This is probably one of my favorite pieces I've made so far, probably mainly because it was also the hardest one. After this one, the king and queen were actually pretty simple. After you've beaten everything else that has come your way, you finally reach the newly risen promised consort Radahn, revived by the person right next to him, Miquella. I think these two make the most sense for the king and queen piece, with Radahn obviously being the queen piece. In chess, the queen is the most powerful piece, and once the king has been beaten, the game is over. Miquella is the character behind the most significant parts of the DLC, with Radahn fighting you in the end to protect Miquella's plan. To model Radahn's armor, I basically did the same that I did for Mesmer and Relana. Only the parts on his upper body I had to actually sculpt to create these lion ornaments. Lastly, I found this really cool artwork by Gon's art with his sword slammed into the ground, creating this crater of spiky rocks, which served as the main inspiration for his base. And speaking of base, to make Mikola's piece a little more special, I thought it would be fun for him to have no actual base. Instead, his hair could serve as a base to stand on. The same technique I used for Radahn's hair, I used for Mikola as well. Sculpting the main body of hair, refining it a bit, then using individual strands to give it a bit more depth and volume. And of course, just like last time, you can get these pieces and print them yourself by clicking the first link in the description. For a fun little bonus, if you're watching this within the first week of this video's release, make sure to use this code for a nice discount. The code will only work for 1 week though, so everyone who is here early gets a little thank you gift from me. These two sets have been a really fun project. Now my question to you is, what else would you like to see? Maybe more pieces to customize the sets? Other sets based on a different IP? Maybe something completely different? Let me know in the comments below. And just like last time, this is what the set could look like if you print them out and maybe refine them with some brass colored paint.